I want to introduce the chair of the Denver Council on Foreign Relations and the Dean of Corbell School of International Studies, Fritz Mayer, who will introduce our speaker and will be a part of the conversation with our speaker. And for the uninitiated, by the way, in this room, I will be going around with a microphone, probably this one, allowing you to ask questions, which you can't get from any other organization in this town to have this personal conversation. Thank you so much. Here you go, Fritz.
All right. There we go. Get rid of that. Anyway, good to see everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's a real treat this evening to have Ambassador Robert Blake with us. We were just discussing it, at the table, sort of recounting various places that he's been. He's really had an extraordinary career in public life in the State Department, from being DCM in India, where he was DCM of the year, which is, there's a lot of DCMs in the world, so that's pretty impressive, to several ambassadorships, most recently the ambassador to Indonesia, which is, we were saying, probably the biggest country in the world no one knows much about, an incredibly important country that we probably all need to know more about. And we'll spend a little time maybe at the end, and we can certainly talk more in Q&A. And then to quite an active role, both in his role as ambassador several places, but particularly in Indonesia, but working directly with John Kerry around issues of climate, which I think is a passion of his. He was telling us he's quite a hiker, so I think there's a kind of a personal interest in this. And from the sound of it, I think we'd all have a hard time keeping up with him on the trails. But an extraordinary career. Focused on, obviously, in Southeast Asia. I've hardly done justice to all of the stops you've had, but there are very few people really in the world who know more about Indonesia. You're chair of the U.S.-Indonesia Society, I think it is, and we could talk a bit more about that. But the focus initially, at least, will be on climate change as advertised. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with all of these nice folks and in this lovely setting. So thanks for the invite.
So we're going to talk a little bit as advertised. We'll spend a little time just talking, and then we will open up for plenty of time for questions. We're going to talk about climate change. So let's not everyone in the room follows this as closely as you do. So let's just start with how much trouble are we in here? I mean, it was the hottest year of the world, ever last year. We're going to crush that this year. The goal was 1.5, where the momentum of the system already is probably taking us past that number. Just how much urgency should we all be feeling right now?
Well, first of all, you're right about how we've, in many ways, already passed some of the goals. The Secretary General of the United Nations last year called it the year of global boiling, not global warming. We can't talk about global warming anymore. I think that was pretty apt. And I think all of you saw the headlines and probably experienced a lot of that yourself here in Denver with fires and these other catastrophic events around the world. So for those of you who don't have a lot of background, there have been these series of what they call conferences of parties meetings, annual meetings that have been taking place since 1995, where all of the countries of the world get together to hopefully set targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and thereby reduce global warming. And I think it's important to start by saying that we have made progress, because sometimes all you hear is the gloom and doom. When these things first started in 1995, the projections were that we were going to warm by about 4 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. And now we're much closer to 1.5. And to answer your question very succinctly, I would give the world about a B minus, and I'll just explain why. If you look at what the countries are doing, there's been a steady improvement in what they call their nationally determined contributions, the pledges that they make at these annual conferences to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And my old boss, John Kerry, used to kind of do a rack and stack of where these countries were. And about 65% of the major economies of the world had targets consistent with the 1.5 degrees centigrade goal. So that's pretty good. But that then led to the other 35%. And so that's where he really kind of focused his efforts. And a lot of these were the very big countries of the world: Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, Brazil, and countries like that. And so he, as you know, spent a lot of time traveling around all these countries and jawboning them and trying to get them to agree to work with us and work with the rest of the international community to generate more ambition in their targets. And I must say we're going to miss him when he finally does leave this year. So somebody did one of these racks and stacks in terms of looking at all the commitments. If they were all actually implemented, where would we be? And so the director of the International Energy Agency, a wonderful guy called Fatih Birol, made a projection last year that if everything was implemented, all the country pledges were implemented, we would be at about 1.8 degrees, maybe 1.7 degrees. The problem is very few countries are actually meeting their own targets. I think something like 30 out of 193 countries are meeting the targets that they themselves have set. So it's a pretty miserable record of implementation. Now, so that's the bad news. The good news is that the private sector and market forces are really moving ahead and really causing very good progress. Obviously, one of the most important things that has to happen is to reduce use of fossil fuels and increase the use of renewable energy. We've now crossed a threshold where the costs of wind and solar are cheaper than fossil fuels in almost every country in the world. Not every country, but almost every country. And that in turn has led to a very rapid deployment of renewable energy. So 2 years ago, the world crossed the 1 trillion annual mark in terms of investments in renewable energy. That was then doubled or almost doubled to 1.5 trillion last year. So it's moving very, very fast. And the goal is to have a threefold increase from last year's rate by 2030. So a very substantial increase, which would be great. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of investments in new technologies. So you hear a lot about things like green hydrogen, electric vehicle batteries, many, many other new technologies that are coming on stream now. And as more and more people scale them, the costs are coming down and they're going to be, in much greater use. So the ones you're probably most familiar with are electric vehicles. Everybody moans and groans about how the electric vehicles are not moving as fast as maybe they should. That's actually not true. The sales of electric vehicles in the United States were almost 50% higher last year than the year before. So they are moving faster. And as the Inflation Reduction Act incentives begin to kick in and we have more charging stations, and as more and more companies put out cheaper models of cars, we're going to see, I think, a real explosion in electric vehicles. So that was a rather long answer to a short question.
That's great. So let me
sort of set the table.
Yeah, well, I love that you came to the glass half full part of the story, and so that's great. But I'm gonna press you a bit on the glass half empty side. So in an era of great inflation, B minus is still not that great. So yes, it's true that there's renewables moving rapidly, technology, and yet last year was the record number of carbon emissions and methane, which is deeply worrisome. That if you chart it, this is a chart. This is what it looks like, just like this, and you still have places like India Probably, I don't know Indonesia very well, so I'd be really curious to know more about Indonesia. China has set these goals, and all of, as you say, the targets are voluntary targets. There's no enforcement mechanism, and already we're lagging behind those targets. So I guess they. So that's the picture. The COP process is one. This was COP 28, so this is the 28th meeting. You know, so you would say, well, without that, we'd be on a trajectory to get 4%, but we're still
Flirting with danger.
We're still flirting with danger. So let me ask you specifically about the last COP, held in Dubai, overseen by the person who's also the Minister of Energy, and so a lot of talk about conflict of interest. Big tussle over wording and how aggressive the final communique would be, kind of watered down at the end. So to say, well, we're going to phase out fossil fuels. So let me ask you specifically about that COP. You were there. Since we're talking grades, what grade would you give the last meeting in Dubai?
Well, again, I think on ambition, it was good. And the key things that came out of it, one was the fossil fuels language. So that was the first time in any COP that countries had come together to agree that finally, yes, we need to phase down the use of fossil fuels. So, and that was a big deal because, as you say, UAE is, of course, a major fossil fuel producer. Saudi Arabia was kicking and screaming through the whole process, resisting that. And so they finally came on board as well. But it's not going to be easy. Let's be honest. And the world went backwards for a while because of what happened in Ukraine. So, you know, we've got to make up that ground as well. So there's still a long way to go. Part of the problem is that there are huge fossil fuel subsidies still around the world. So those need to be phased out as well. You mentioned methane. Methane is the most powerful of the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you can make a difference on methane, you can make a much bigger difference in terms of the entire effort. And now we have 3/4 of the world are engaged in what's called the Global Methane Pledge. And in fact, one of the companies that I'm working with in my private capacity is a wonderful company called GHGSat. And what they do is they monitor methane emissions from outer space. And that's basically emissions from old oil and gas infrastructure that is so old that's leaking methane. And so they have now technology, and this is one of many great technologies that are emerging, to detect exactly where that's happening so that the governments can then go in and either rebuild that part of the pipeline or plug it in some way and stop the release of those methane. So there's serious efforts on methane taking place, and those are being monitored very carefully by the NGO community. I mentioned the renewable energy target that, again, you know, quite ambitious to triple renewable energy by 2030. The other one was to double energy efficiency by 2030, which again, it's sort of a little known part of it, but extremely important. And there's a lot of things that can be done to improve energy efficiency. So all in all, again, I think from the ambition perspective, it was good. The problem is just going to be the implementation part and getting all these countries to actually knuckle down. And so what they try to do to kind of provide a little more of incentive is that 2 years from now, all countries are going to have to come back with renewed plans for how they're going to meet these targets with actual implementation plans. So we'll see if that really helps. I hope it does. And you know, I think one of the really great services that John Kerry did was he would go around all these countries and really call them out and say, okay, you've made a pledge for whatever you've made, but I got to tell you, Mr. Minister, you're not even close to what you've said. And then he'd go out and talk about it publicly and really put pressure on them. So that's the kind of diplomacy that you really need to really hold these guys' feet to the fire and make sure that they're actually doing what they promised they said they would do.
Let me ask you about another aspect of what happened in Dubai, which is we've been talking about the so-called mitigation side of the problem, that is to say, to limit the magnitude of climate change, to reduce carbon emissions and to get the world community on board in taking action. The other piece that's crucially important is the so-called adaptation side of things. So the inevitable, no matter how effective we are in mitigation, the inevitable need to adapt to changes that are really already baked into the system. There's so-called loss and damage provisions in the COP, pressure from developing countries in particular for assistance from wealthier countries to help with adaptation, which is already a huge problem. I mean, the conflict in the Sahel, you could argue, are in some ways climate related. We can talk about, we see this, of course, in Colorado as well. Talk about how well is that going? There are various estimates, 400 billion a year, needed for adaptation. The world community has been very slow to actually fund adaptation. Recognize that's a hard problem because you're asking for people, wealthy countries, to put money into poor. But say a word about your take on that, which has got to be relevant in your own experience in Indonesia.
So it's a great question. And again, it's a mixed picture. If you talk to what are the countries doing and what are the big countries like our own doing in terms of climate finance, it's a D-. If you ask what is the private sector doing, particularly the private banks, but also increasingly the large foundations, Bloomberg, the Bezos Fund, started by Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Rockefeller Foundation, they're pouring in literally billions of dollars now into a lot of these very, very important things. But to get back to your question on the official side, as Fred said, for the first time, a loss and damage fund was created, but with a pitiful amount of money. This is going to require tens of billions of dollars, and less than $1 billion has been approved so far. And one of the biggest laggards, quite frankly, is the United States. Our own Congress is not willing to approve money for this kind of thing, and particularly the House Republicans are firmly opposed to any kind of climate finance. And so we can talk later about the Indonesian initiative that I was involved in, but here we had a sort of a very embarrassing situation where we and the Japanese were leading this initiative, a $20 billion initiative, and yet we ourselves had a very difficult time cobbling together even a modest amount of financing that we could provide to this very, very important initiative. So in a way, we were kind of tin cupping everybody else and sort of saying, sorry, we're really not going to be able to do our share, which was too bad. And if the United States doesn't do it, then that kind of provides an out for everybody else, because there's less pressure on them because they can say, well, the United States can't do it, we're not going to do it either, because everybody's got financing problems. But let me come back to the private sector side of it. One of the really important things that's happening now that all of you should be aware of is that companies around the world are setting their own net zero 2050 targets. And there's a process called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which encourages companies to come in and make pledges. And then those pledges go through a very detailed technical process to make sure that they're actually credible and that they can be implemented. And then they're given 24 months to actually implement them. And if they don't do it and they don't stay on schedule, they're kicked out of the process. So they can't say, oh, I'm part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and they don't do anything. So 4,650 global multinational corporations, large corporations, have approved targets now, which is fantastic. And these are some of the biggest corporations in the world: Walmart, Amazon, a lot of the airlines now, Nike. I mean, there's a huge number of them. So, and the reason that's important is not just because they themselves have their own targets, but part of the target is that they have to make sure that their own supply chains also are abiding by that. So you can imagine Walmart. Walmart is a huge importer of goods into the United States. So exporters from Indonesia or India suddenly are being told by Walmart, oh, by the way, if you want to continue to export to us, you're going to have your own science-based target, and you're going to have to figure out how you can improve your climate, reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions. Many of them don't even know what greenhouse gas emissions are. So that's actually something that I'm working on now, is to set up a program in Indonesia and India and some others to actually talk them through what are the requirements going to be on in terms of climate compliance. So again, the private sector is going to drive a lot of this growth in a way that governments just can't do, because these are market forces, and companies like Walmart understand not only is it in their kind of public relations interest, but this is this actually makes good commercial and business sense for them to do this.
Yeah, and they're probably, the insurance companies, the reinsurers are increasingly, asking for that as well. Let me ask you about, so we're now back in the half full side of the equation, which I like, and another phenomenon which I think is really interesting. It's not really one that State Department deals with, but this is subnational action. So cities, well, like Denver, states like Colorado, cities around the world as part of the C40, various initiatives are sort of voluntarily taking action, almost independent of what's happening at the national level. How important is that phenomenon? Is that part of the picture that encourages you?
It's hugely important, and it is very, very essential to the future of this whole movement. And I'll just give you two concrete examples. When Donald Trump pulled us out of the COP process when he became president the last time around, it didn't really have that much of an impact, because so many states were already committed with their own very serious goals. And a country like California, which is, I think, the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world.
And it is now a country?
If it was an independent country.
Oh,
So, when they set their own standards,
soon,
every company that operates in California has to abide by those. So they're not going to create two different sets of standards. They're not going to have one standard for California and one standard for Oklahoma. They're going to have one standard. So it really matters. And so the fact that so many different states and so many different counties and municipalities got together and said, we don't care what the Trump administration is doing, we're going to stick by our targets, really mattered. And so our own greenhouse gas emissions didn't rise as much as you might think during the Trump years, because of the subnational progress that continued to be made. So it's super important. And Kerry spent a lot of his time working at the subnational level for precisely this reason.
Okay, you mentioned Trump. So that's
President Trump.
Former President Trump. You may know he's running for election. I guess earlier you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, measures that have been taken by the Biden administration, including rejoining the Paris Accords and showing up at the COP and a host of other things. So you just argued, and I agree with you, that the impact of Trump's administration was less than many feared the last time around. What are the likely implications if Trump is returned to the White House in terms of our leadership in the world, the whole international process, or any other piece that you'd like to take?
Well, it will be serious. Let's not kid ourselves. I'm sure he's going to again pull us out of the whole COP process for sure. I mean, it'll probably be one of the first things he does on day one. He's unabashedly said he's going to promote more oil and gas. I mean, every speech he gives, he talks about drill, baby, drill. And he doesn't want to promote renewable energy, which doesn't, but again, I think the train has left the station on that. The market forces are going to dictate that we're going to continue to see a rapid expansion of renewable energy no matter what he does. The Inflation Reduction Act is actually interesting. It's a $370 billion piece of legislation. So a lot of money has been poured into this. It has then generated substantially more projects. I just saw a piece of paper today from the Department of Energy that there's something like 50,000 new projects that have been started as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. And what's interesting is 80% of those projects are in red states, are in Republican-controlled states. And that's intentional because they wanted to kind of, in a way, make this a little bit Trump-proof. And so it's going to be much harder because a lot of these governors and subnational leaders are going to be reluctant to give up all these subsidies because these are creating important jobs and creating new national product at a time when, the economy's been suffering a little bit. So the green economy is becoming a much more important part of our overall economic future. So I think he's going to have a much harder time. It's going to be, I've heard the comparison to when he tried to repeal Obamacare and really had a hard time doing that. It's going to be a little bit the same thing with the Inflation Reduction Act, because there's much more support than I think he really realizes. But I will say the one area that I do worry about that is there where he will have a considerable impact is on the climate finance side, because he's not going to do anything, and the Republicans in Congress will support him on that. And so, and U.S. leadership is really, really important on that. And even if it's a little bit, I just worry that all of that's going to be completely wiped out at a time when it's really, really important. And why is it important? It's important because a lot of these countries, think about, Fritz mentioned Africa. I spent the early part of my life in many parts of Africa living with my dad, who was a Foreign Service officer. And, many parts of Africa are still desperately poor. And they're just beginning to get access to energy. It's one of the most important things you can do: health, education, and access to electricity. Those are the things that will help move a poor person into the middle class. And so what kind of energy they source really matters. If we can get them right from the beginning to be sourcing renewable energy and provide the financing for that, because they don't have the finance to do that, it'd make a huge difference to the whole climate effort. Whereas if they go back to relying on coal and fossil fuels, it'll set back the entire movement. So the climate finance piece really matters, not just for loss and damage, adaptation, things like that, but for the future of these poorer countries like Africa.
Yeah. Well, let me pick up on that because, and maybe get you to draw you out a bit on your experiences in Indonesia, because you were really involved in some really innovative projects, I know, in Indonesia that of this kind, where you're really trying to help have a green development path as opposed to a brown one, or fossil fuel intensive one. So say a few words about some of the things we've talked a bit about, the things you were involved in Indonesia.
So I want to first call out Sherry Ullery, who actually did all the work that I'm about to talk about, because she was instrumental in all of this. But let me just tell two quick stories. One was before I went out to be ambassador, Kerry called me into his office, as he does with all ambassadors going out to big countries. And he kind of laughed, and he had this instruction in his hand. Every ambassador gets a letter of instruction listing the 45,000 things you're supposed to be doing as ambassador. And it's got such a laundry list that nobody pays any attention to it. But he said, okay, I've got this letter here for you, but as far as I'm concerned, there's only one thing I want you to do. I want you to figure out how we're going to get Indonesia to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, because they were at that time the 6th largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And he says, and it's not going to be easy because the current government's in its last year, so you're going to have to figure something out. But you're a smart guy, you'll figure it out. Off you go. So it was like a 30-second conversation with him, and so we pulled together the whole country team, as they call it, all the heads of sections in the embassy, and kind of had a big meeting about what we should do. And we came up with the idea that we should do a private sector initiative. And one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Indonesia at the time was from palm oil, which is this very versatile oil that can be used in all kinds of things. Every one of your products that you use every day has palm oil in it. And palm oil was responsible for the massive deforestation that had taken place in Indonesia over the last 25 years. So we came up with an idea that we should just get the big palm oil companies to agree to a very simple pledge, which was no further cutting of primary forests that had never been cut, no further clearing of any peatland, which are very, very important in Indonesia, and then any new planting would be done on previously cleared land. So, you might think that's a pretty simple thing. Sherry and I and others called together all the environmental groups that were working on this and said, okay, this is what we're going to do, but we want to make sure you all support this and you think this is a good idea. Thumbs up. Everybody was very happy about it. They said, good luck if you think you're going to get them to do this. But we started with the most progressive companies first, which turned out to be a company in Singapore, a company called Wilmar. And then we worked our way down the list. And, you know, I went to talk to the chairman of Wilmar, and I said, Mr. Chairman, you've got a problem. You know, everybody in the United States and the European Union think that associate your products with climate change. So you've got to mend your ways. I was more polite than that, but and he said, you're right, and we'll do it. And I said, okay, can I tell the other companies that you're the anchor tenant of this initiative? He said, yes. And so we just picked our way across all of them. So I think we probably spent about $3,000 in travel costs for me and staff and stuff like that. And we got this palm oil pledge together. And then here's the really important piece that is important for you all to know. We gave the entire initiative over to the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce so they could claim credit for it. So that when it was announced publicly, everybody would say, rah, rah, what a great Indonesian initiative. Whereas if it had been an American initiative, everybody would have said, why are we allowing the Americans to push us around like this? This is terrible. And so it was really, really important to give them full credit. And an American diplomat was not within 200 miles of the announcement of what happened. And so, but the net result has been that deforestation has gone down steadily, more in Indonesia than in any other country in the world in the last 6 years, because of these palm oil companies have kept their pledge and have kept their word. So it does show the importance of getting companies on board, and you know, they can really make a difference. And in this case, they are. It's not perfect. There's still deforestation going on, but it's far lower. And they've been a great example for the Brazils and the Congos of the world, where there's still pretty serious problems. So based on that, Kerry then said, I'd long since retired, and he called me back and said, I'm doing this really big initiative in Indonesia to get them to decarbonize their entire economy. Can you come in and help? Because I've got all these really smart mid-level people, but nobody who can get in to see a minister, and they all still know you and, you know, like you. And I said, sure. So I went back in part-time for a year, and I got to say, Kerry did all the work. He was really, really great. And eventually, and I can tell you in more detail if you're interested, but the end of the story was it's a $20 billion initiative, $10 billion from the United States, Japan, and mostly other G7 countries, and then $10 billion from the private banks, mostly in the United States, but a Japanese bank and a German bank and a few others, and to transform Indonesia's energy sector, to rapidly scale up renewables and hopefully begin to accelerate the decommissioning of coal-fired power plants, because Indonesia has a huge amount of coal. You know, and it's a big deal. It'll really matter. And so it's had its growing pains. I can tell you about that. But it's a really important thing, and the Indonesians are really committed to it now. And so it's a good example of how, you know, diplomats with not a lot of money, we can get stuff done and then mobilize money from other people. And again, a little bit embarrassing, we don't have a lot of money to put on the table ourselves, but we have some, because mostly in the form of financing for projects that will enable this renewable energy, these projects to come on board. So you know, in the end, I think we'll provide close to $1 billion in that kind of financing, but it's not grant aid. That's what they're really after, is grant money. No, we can't do that.
Great story. So just quickly, you referenced Sherry. I don't know how many of you know Sherry O'Leary, who's running this organization right now, but in a previous life was program officer and an official in the State Department, and she is the reason Ambassador Blake is here this evening. So let me just acknowledge that as well. So, so you all know her background. So, let me ask one. We're going to open up for questions, and but I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open up. Which is, I can't help it since we have you here. Indonesia, big election coming up. It's sort of been in the news. You know, the headline the other day was democracy backsliding, and, you know, a lot of anxiety about the political system in Indonesia. One way to frame this is why should we care? Like, what is important for us to know about what is happening in Indonesia now in terms of the election and the politics and the political system there.
Well, as Fritz said, it's probably the largest country in the world that no American has ever heard of. It's kind of a shame. They don't do a very good job of marketing themselves. But if you look at Indonesia on a map and if you stretch from its northernmost point to its southernmost point, or east-west, it basically runs from Alaska all the way to Florida. It's a huge country, 270 million people, 17,000 islands, 6,000 inhabited islands. But strategically for us, they're the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world, which really matters in the post-Arab conflict, world. And they're also a huge market for the United States now. There's the group of 10 Southeast Asian countries called the ASEAN nations. The headquarters of ASEAN is located in Jakarta, in the capital of Indonesia, because Indonesia is by far the largest economy of the 10 countries, and also the most important. And so the various economic estimates show that because there's a growing integration of this market, it's the third largest market for American products after China and India. And it's going to continue to grow because there's a relatively young population still. So by some estimates, Indonesia may have the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world by 2050. So, they're going to come up rapidly in the world. Again, they're doing a skillful job of balancing China and the United States. China, like every other country in Southeast Asia, is by far the largest market for their products and an increasingly important investor. But they also worry about China. China's not an easy country to deal with. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of horrible labor and environmental standards that come with Chinese projects, the famous Belt and Road Initiative. And so they definitely want to balance that. They worry about more aggressive Chinese tactics in the South China Sea, and worry that they're going to see more and more Chinese submarines and various kinds of military vessels in Indonesian waters. So the relationship with the United States is a very, very important counterbalance to that. And they all want to have more market access into the United States, of course. A lot of Indonesian students, of course, want to travel. We have tremendous soft power in a place like Indonesia that China can't even possibly match. So it's really important. And this election was very important because it's now the end of 2 terms of the current president that I worked under. And he was term limited. And, God bless him, he stepped down. So they've got this election that just took place 2 days ago. And a former general who ran unsuccessfully twice previously against Jokowi and lost, put himself up a third time, very cleverly took Jokowi's son as his running mate. Jokowi's very, very popular still in Indonesia. He's got an 80% approval rating. And this time he got himself over the finish line. And under Indonesian law, you have to get at least 50% of the vote, or else there has to be a runoff. To everybody's surprise, including my own, he got almost 60% of the vote. So he got a first-round victory. As Fritz alluded, there's a little bit of concerns because he has a very checkered human rights background from when he was a general and running East Timor in the 1990s. When Jakarta went through its own, Indonesia went through its own kind of political opening in 1998. There were human rights abuses then as well. A lot of student activists were kidnapped and disappeared and were never found. And Prabowo was accused of being responsible for that. He never admitted that. And there was never really any proof of that, but there was, he was in charge of the unit that was responsible for that. Anyway, so there's concerns that he will be a very autocratic leader. I'm personally not as worried as everyone else because I think that Indonesia now has democracy in its DNA, and any leader that has to run Indonesia has to deal with the leaders of the 34 provinces whose power has been devolved to them. They have big budgets to run on their own. So they are major players, and any leader has to deal with them. And then Indonesia has a huge number of political parties. So any leader has to forge a workable coalition with all of them to get his or her program through the parliament. And so Jokowi did that very well. He brought all of his opponents either into his cabinet or at least into his coalition. And Prabowo was a perfect example of that. He was his opponent in the elections, and then he became defense minister. So I think that he's going to try to emulate that. And he also, I think, wants Indonesia to play a greater role in the world. He thinks that Indonesia underperformed on the foreign policy front during Jokowi's realm, which he did, which is right. So I think he wants to play a greater role. And so he has to continue these democratic traditions, in my view. So I'm a little bit more skeptical that he's going to try to take over the country and be the autocrat that a lot of people say he is, but we'll see. As I did an interview with the New York Times, and I said, first thing we always say is we judge people by their actions, not by their words. And so we'll just have to see what they do.
Well, you can see something in the range of topics that the ambassador can talk on. Let's open the floor for questions. Rob, you've got the mic, so I'll let you pass that around, and look forward to hearing your questions.
I'll make sure this thing is live. You're not allowed, you kept talking about retirement a couple times tonight. You're not allowed to retire. Okay.
You don't mind just introducing yourself, just so
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Paul. I am a DCFR member, and I'm a student at CU Denver in downtown. I rode my bike 8 miles today.
All right.
Yeah. So I did a student exchange in Berlin this time last year for 3 months, and I worked with the Ecological Institute on renewable and sustainability. And so my disappointment was I found out that the EU was going for the carbon offsetting route, right? Like, we're dealing with airline companies here in Denver that are, along with the military and airlines are usually our biggest carbon producers as far as private source. I could be wrong with industrialization, but my disappointment is that the idea that you could purchase a certain amount of carbon to store all the offsetting that you're producing at the same time, and then you literally watch your carbon offset asset go up in flames with the new fire, or any fire for that matter. And so I guess my question to you, Ambassador, is that as in good intention as it is to store carbon, I don't think that there's any regulation to actually verify or justify that it's not a scam.
That's a great question. So there's a lot of things to unpack in your question. Let me just take maybe 2 of them. First of all, in terms of the overall carbon market, the single greatest thing that the world could do would be to set a price for carbon. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen because there's no support for that whatsoever. However, what is going to happen is you're going to start hearing a lot more about something called CBAM, which is the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a trade mechanism which they are going to use to enforce measuring of carbon, the carbon intensity of imports coming into the European Union. So that is going to take effect in 2027 and is going to have a major impact on the world because it's going to force countries to have their own carbon pricing, including the United States. Of course, it's riddled with question marks right now, but they've taken the first step of announcing it. And, they're getting comments and, everybody's complaining about it, but they're going to go ahead with it, and God bless them. So this is going to be a really, really important thing, and it's going to be important to see. And already there's a bill now circulating in the United States Senate, sponsored by Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island and Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Mr. Oil and Gas. So, so he recognizes that these things are coming down the pike and that they need to do something about it. So it's a little known fact right now, but keep your eyes on this. This is interesting. Now, the carbon offset question is interesting. As you rightly said, a lot of people, including my old boss, John Kerry, a little bit skeptical about carbon offsets. He said, okay, carbon offsets are okay as long as they're not a substitute for fossil fuel companies decarbonizing and getting out of the fossil fuel business. It can't be a crutch to allow them to continue to produce the fossil fuels for the rest of their lives. So that's sort of one of the big knocks against carbon offsets. In terms of the integrity question that you're talking about, this has been a big subject of conversation at all the COPs. And I think next year, the next COP is going to be in Baku in Azerbaijan this November. And one of the goals that they have set for themselves is to establish a credible market mechanism with credible standards under what's called Article 6 on just this issue. And this could be really, really important. And I'll just give you the example of Indonesia. I had a good friend of mine who works out in Papua, which is the very farthernmost eastern region of Indonesia, which is by far the least developed, huge forest reserves, and therefore a great prize for a lot of people to cut down all those trees. And a friend of mine was working for one of the big NGOs out there, and I had dinner with him. He was back in Washington. I said, "So how's it going?" He said, "Well, you want the good news or the bad news?" I said, "Well, give me the good news." He said, "Well, the good news is that the local leaders of Papua have decided to set aside an additional 40% of their forested area as protected land." I said, "Well, that's fantastic news. How can there be anything bad?" He said, "The bad news is they haven't gotten a cent of compensation for it because the global carbon market yet doesn't really exist, and the offset market hasn't really been developed in Indonesia yet. So normally they could expect to get some sort of compensation for protecting forests and basically the carbon that would have been emitted from cutting down those trees, you would get a credit for that. But the system hasn't been set up yet. So therefore, there's no incentive for them really to keep this. So getting this Article 6 framework in place would help the countries of Indonesia and would help them, let's say Amazon, who has giant data centers in Indonesia because of the digital economy there. For now, they have to source coal because that's the only thing going. They would love to be able to get renewable energy, but it's not yet available. So they are purchasing offsets. And they would love to be able to purchase offsets to protect forests in Papua or anywhere else in Indonesia, but the market just doesn't exist. But once it does, the Amazons and the Walmarts and the others of the world will invest in a big time way. And that in itself will encourage more preservation of these forests because they'll be able to derive income from that preservation. So it's important. Sorry, rather long answer to your question.
Hello,
Hi.
my name is Alexa, and I'm not entirely sure what my question is, but I'm very interested in the idea of Indonesia's relocation of the capital from Jakarta to Nusantara. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong.
Good pronunciation.
Thank
Well
you.
done.
And I understand that there's a goal of having it be a city that is 100% fueled by renewable energies, but relocating from Jakarta, heavily populated, to Borneo, which is both a preserved, sort of sacred environmental space, and also an island that is shared with 2 other countries. I'm curious what the political and environmental implications of creating this entirely new city in such a pristine space is.
Another good question with many different aspects to it. Let me try to answer it simply. Jakarta is right by the water, and Jakarta is sinking, both because of rising sea levels, but also because of subsidence, because they've used up too much of their groundwater. So at any time of the year, up to 1/3 of Jakarta can be underwater. And when they have these really bad storms, it's much worse than that. So, the center of the city is sometimes just underwater. So it is a serious problem that they have to deal with. So Jokowi, the current president, had the idea, well, let's move the capital to Kalimantan, which is Indonesian Borneo. As you rightly said, it's split in half between the southern part of Borneo is Indonesian. It's called Kalimantan. And so he wanted to move and has started the process of moving the capital. It has faced huge resistance, as you can imagine, from most bureaucrats who don't want to move to some empty space out in the middle of nowhere. And not to mention the business community, which probably won't move. It'll be like New York. They'll just stay and it'll become the commercial capital. It was a big issue in the presidential campaign. Several of the candidates said, no, we're not going to do this. This is crazy. It costs so much money. We can just expand into other parts of Java, right next to where Jakarta is right now. Why should we spend all this money? So it has been controversial, but Jokowi's determined to proceed. Prabowo, I think, is going to do so as well, in part because his brother has invested and bought a lot of the land around that area. So his family is going to benefit quite handsomely from the development of this new capital. So it's going to go ahead, but it is a controversial project, and I think it's a little bit like the capital of Kazakhstan, which there is a new capital in the middle of the country, and it makes sense, but the sort of the vibrant life of Kazakhstan is in the old capital still, and that's where even today all the bureaucrats go to work during the week and then they fly back to the old capital, and that'll probably be the same thing here. So, but I think it was started with good intentions by the president. The green part of it is a little bit open to question. They've made a big point of how they're not going to cut down a lot of trees, and but that's impossible. They had to cut down some trees. There's a big reforestation effort taking place. The big question is where's the real energy going to come from? They say it's going to come from new hydropower projects, but new hydropower projects are not as green as everybody thinks they are, because when you dam up a river, you flood a lot of tropical forest, and that is the equivalent of cutting the trees down. They start to release large amounts of greenhouse gas and methane once they're underwater. So that's been what we've seen in places like Brazil. So the net greenness of these projects is really not as great as you might think. And it's going to take a while for these projects to come online, the hydropower projects. They're being built by the Chinese, you guessed it. And so there are a lot of questions about really how green this is all going to be. And for the moment, they're going to have to rely on fossil fuels still. Again, sort of a B- C+ for that effort.
By the way, this side of the room is winning right now.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Sid Brooks. Thank you for coming. Your discussion is very enlightening for many of us. This is a subject that is too invisible to the American public, and I'm glad you're helping educate us. You've explained how important economically Indonesia is, how its geographical expanse is very substantial, and it can play a very important role, certainly in the Pacific and the South Pacific. Can you give us your views of what role Indonesia can and will play as competition between China and the United States continues to seem to be exacerbated over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as the gentleman alluded, there's the sort of great game of influence going on now between the United States and China, really globally, about whose model of development, whose model of governance is going to prevail. And of course, the Chinese are peddling their own sort of autocratic model and state-led growth model and so forth. Indonesia Southeast Asia is a bit of a prize because it is such an important market. And so both of our countries are making it a priority. I think the most interesting area where this is playing out is in green supply chains, specifically in first the critical minerals that are going to be needed for electric vehicle batteries, for electric vehicles themselves, for things like blades for wind turbines, things like that. Indonesia is blessed with many of those critical minerals. So they have nickel, they have copper, they have bauxite, all of which are going to be in not only growing demand for the foreseeable future as this green economy progresses. So the Chinese have moved in very quickly into Indonesia to develop particularly nickel processing for electric vehicle batteries. The Chinese have their own very well-developed electric vehicle system. If you ask Elon Musk, who is his greatest competitor in the world, he'll say right away, it's the Chinese. He doesn't worry at all about the Europeans or even other American companies. But the Chinese are moving out very, very smartly, in part because the government gave them very, very handsome subsidies, but did it 10 or 15 years ago. So they've had a chance to really develop their technology. And it's some of the best in the world. So, so the Chinese have good relations with the Indonesians. They've moved in very, very quickly into eastern Indonesia where the deposits of nickel are. But it's controversial because, as I alluded earlier, they have not followed any kind of environmental or labor standards. They bring in a lot of their own Chinese labor, which itself is controversial in Indonesia, where they have a surplus of labor. But they also have really run roughshod over the environment. So there've been terrible stories about groundwater leakage of toxic chemicals and massive fish kills and all the rest that you would expect to see in any place that doesn't abide by normal environmental standards. So, so there's been a lot of hand-wringing in the US Congress about how, oh, China is locking up all these critical minerals, and we've got to do something about it. The problem is, in an election year, nobody wants to do anything with Indonesia because of the environmental and labor standards. And they're worried that that would have a political impact of some sort on Joe Biden's reelection prospects. So my own view is that there is a way forward. We should just say, if an American company goes into Indonesia, and we should encourage that, that they should abide by international environmental and labor standards. And they'll be happy to do that. They do that anyway. So it's not going to be any new requirement for them. And the other thing that I think is going to be very, very important that will be difficult for Indonesia to achieve is, again, a lot of these big mining companies now have their own net zero targets. So one condition for their investments around the world now is, can they source renewable energy? And these are very energy intensive projects, these mineral processing plants. So Indonesia is going to have a hard time doing that because a lot of most of what they've been doing is using coal and fossil fuels to date. So Carrie and I were pushing them really hard to stop that and to begin to really deploy renewables on a much more massive scale. And one of the interesting new opportunities that's coming through now is in what are called small modular reactors, SMRs, nuclear reactors, which are literally the size, can be fit into a container, a shipping container. And they're very small. They can be as little as 7 megawatts. And they're perfect for this kind of project because these are all off-grid projects. So you need they don't take up a lot of space, of course. And in many cases, the electricity grid is already there. So you don't have to build any new transmission infrastructure. So, and it's clean. Most importantly, there are no greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. So there are options, but Indonesia just they haven't been under sufficient pressure to really deploy those yet. But they now understand that they don't want to be dependent on the Chinese for this. And so they're looking for more investment. But unfortunately, it's not going to happen in the election year this year. And if Trump's elected, I don't know if it ever will, but we'll have to see. Because, but I personally hope that we do encourage more critical mineral investment because we don't want to be dependent on the Chinese. And right now they have a hammerlock on not only the critical minerals part of it, but they've got a real head start on things like the electric vehicle battery industry. Their batteries are generally cheaper and their cars are cheaper and very, very well made. So already there's legislation on the Hill to impose very, very steep tariffs so that Chinese can't come in and just decimate our own nascent electric vehicle market in the United States.
Hi, thank you. My name is John, and congratulations, I'm on the SAIS Alumni Committee out here. So we're glad to see an alum of our graduates go here, go SAIS. And following along on that and some of what you just said, one of the other people involved in the leadership of our state organization would want me to ask this question.
Please.
She spent her career on women's rights around the world with NGOs and done some very difficult things in Muslim countries. So I need to ask you about human rights, women's rights in Indonesia, okay? And where that fits in to U.S. foreign policy towards Indonesia, given everything you've had to say so far. And I come from the realist school, not the idealist school. So your answers are fine with me, but I have to translate them to her. So please use the right words.
Sure.
please.
So the short answer is that human rights are a very, very important part of our policy. And as you all know, we have congressionally mandated reports that we put out every year about the human rights situation in every country in the world, including our own now, but also religious freedom reports, trafficking in person reports. So, we cover the entire waterfront, and it's done in a very independent and objective way. We don't cut corners. We call it like we see it. And we just report the facts. We don't try to, so it's just a very factual report, but it really sets every country's teeth on edge. They hate it because they don't like being graded by the United States for whatever their shortcomings are on religious freedom or whatever it is. But my own view is that it's a really important thing. And, it wasn't so long ago, let's just take religious freedom. There were terrible riots between Muslims and Christians out in eastern parts of Indonesia in the early 2000s, where thousands of people were killed. And so there's been a tremendous improvement in how the country sees the importance of religious freedom. And there's still a lot of very radical people in Indonesia, particularly Muslims. A lot of them have been schooled in Saudi Arabia and in Yemen, and then they've come back and sort of brought some of these Wahhabi ways of thinking. And one of the first things I did when I arrived is I went in to see one of the coordinating ministers and said, the first thing you got to do is stop allowing the Saudis to send people because they're just bringing back poison into your schools. And, it's really going to hurt you. And they kind of poo-pooed it, but I think they're coming around to the view that that's right. So countries they are paying more attention. We are continuing to do this. I think the Biden administration gets mixed marks on a lot of these things. India, for example, there have been some really terrible human rights abuses and religious freedom abuses under Prime Minister Modi. And we've largely swept those under the carpet because India is such an important country as we think about China. And as we think about, this coalition to sort of counter Chinese influence, India is absolutely essential. And so that has really driven a lot of and of course, India is a huge market, and we've had a very strong relationship with them for a long time. But if you studied closely the most recent meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden, the word human rights never crossed either one of their lips. And and maybe that's right. I mean, as you say, you're from the realist school of foreign policy, and sometimes it doesn't mean that we're ignoring the issues. It's just that we don't talk about it that much. And I was before I became ambassador to Indonesia, I was the assistant secretary for South and Central Asia, which is the person in charge of the policy and the person to whom all the ambassadors in the region report. And so I had not only issues in India, although they weren't as bad then, but more importantly in Central Asia, where every single one of those governments had miserable human rights records. And we needed them very badly at the time because we needed to get supplies into our troops in Afghanistan. Pakistan was becoming an impossible country to deal with. So we set up an entire alternate supply route through Central Asia. And part of that had to be to get them both to improve relations with the United States so that they would trust us to do this. But we also had to get them to talk much more about human rights. And they did. It's not perfect, but we had to be able to show progress to get a lot of the things that we needed through Congress. So the State Department continues. This is very much on everybody's radar screen. Likewise, women's rights. I'll just give you one example, but it cuts across everything that we do in the State Department is to promote gender equality. And, in many countries, there's horrible gender-based violence, including Indonesia. And that in itself is a big issue that we have to talk about. But on the positive side, what we've learned is that if you can work with women's NGOs, you're going to get a lot more done. And they're going to give a lot more back to their communities. And I'll just give you one example. I'm on the board of the Asia Foundation, and we've decided we need to do more on climate. And one of the things that we decided to do that is not being done by anybody else is to set up basically a bank where we're going to fund women's owned NGOs that are working on climate, because we think that that by itself will make more of a difference than any single thing that we can do because of, and mostly, and again, if possible, indigenous women's groups, because if you want to protect forests and things like that, you need to have people who have lived on the land, understand it, and want to protect it. And again, these women's groups that are working in those areas just do tremendous work. And what they need is scaling. They need, they need to go from a one-person band trying to do something to a 50-person organization that can really make a difference. And that's what we want to do, is help them to do that.
Okay, we have 2 more questions and they're booked. So we'll go with those questions here. There you go.
Thank you, Ambassador, for coming and for sharing your insights. My name's Jim Marchiori. I'm involved now with a group here in Colorado that is working toward building a private sector based, but public-private ecosystem of organizations that are working toward a net zero climate here in Colorado. And my own thesis going into this is that to achieve this kind of a change, we need a culture change across the general public. And I'd like to know if you can share some experiences that might give some insight or some thoughts into how to achieve something like that.
Boy, that's a big question. I haven't really had that much experience working in the United States, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that. But let me kind of pivot to something else to maybe help answer your question. One of the problems that Carrie was grappling with was, okay, you can work on the power side of things, the energy side, and certainly that's very, very important. But you've also got to work on the industry side, because a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions come from these huge industries like steel and cement. Aviation was mentioned earlier, shipping. And so he came up with this great idea called the First Movers Coalition. And it was to figure out, how do we get companies that are in each of those industries and who are committed to reducing their greenhouse gases to pool their efforts and finance research into technologies that will help them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And if they're all in it together, there's no single company is going to get a competitive advantage, and you can really do something interesting. And so there are now 96 large multinational corporations who are involved in 7 sectors of the First Movers Coalition. And they're making big investments and things that you wouldn't think would be possible. So we talked about aviation earlier. Sustainable aviation fuel is one of the biggies. How can you get if every single person in this room has a carbon footprint? I would guess that the largest portion of every one of yours, including mine, is the airplanes that we take. So if you can reduce that, you're going to make a huge difference. So that's one of the sectors, is to how to use biofuels mostly to substitute for the existing fuels that are being used now. Another one is in the shipping industry. So you've all heard of Maersk, the great huge shipping line that's in the news now because of all the Houthi attacks on them in the Red Sea. But they are investing with several other shipping companies likewise in what's called the Green Shipping Challenge. And that is also to get a new form of methanol that could be used to substitute for what they're using now. That is actually coming on stream now. It's only a question of scaling it so that you can reduce the costs so that it'll be commercially viable. And they now, as a result of these investments that have been made, they expect to be net zero by 2040, which is unbelievable for a huge company like that with a shipping fleet around the world. So it shows that this kind of stuff can be done. If efforts are pooled in the right way, and if no single company is going to get a commercial disadvantage from making these early investments. it probably doesn't help you because, you know, you're not going to be making billion-dollar investments and that kind of stuff. But it's again, it's a sign of the importance of the private sector and what they can do to really drive innovation.
Last question. Yeah.
Yeah. Wyndham LaPesco, and coincidentally, I'm involved in a major utility scale renewable project down in Texas. But my question, maybe outside your area of expertise, but would you comment on the recent elections in Pakistan?
Yeah, it's a little out of my, because I'm a little dated on this, but as you all know, the famous cricket player Imran Khan has been in and out of politics for a long time, and he got into a bit of a fight with the military. Pakistani military really controls Pakistan. They have huge investments in virtually every sector of the economy, so they have an inordinate influence. So every political leader in Pakistan has to kowtow to the military, and Imran Khan decided he wasn't going to do that anymore. So they cut him off at the knees and conjured up a corruption case against him, and he's in jail now. But much to their great surprise and regret, independent parties that were associated with him went ahead and won a plurality, or not a plurality, they won a majority in the elections. So it was a very awkward situation for them. But those independent parties, they didn't want to form a coalition. They didn't have enough of a plurality to actually form a government on their own. And he didn't want to do it they didn't want to form a coalition because they felt that would basically water down their positions. So they're in the opposition, and the two other parties have formed a coalition. But it's going to be a very unstable coalition, and you know, so unfortunately, it's going to be more of the same in Pakistan, and which is too bad because it's a country that deserves more. Can I just make one final
absolutely
comment?
Yeah,
just
please.
I was a little bit surprised nobody asked me about sort of America's role in the world. And you know, one thing what I try to tell a lot of audiences is that we all read nothing but doom and gloom about how, you know, there's sort of a new multipolar world, and the United States influence is diminishing around the world, and China is becoming this great power. And it's not as true as you might think. If you were to ask almost any leader, and maybe even the Chinese leader, would you rather be the president of the United States or the president of your country? 99.9% would say, I'd rather be the president of the United States. And why is that? If you look at things like technology, 9 of the 10 largest technology companies in the world and most innovative technologies are American. If you look at the finance sector, half of the world's banks who are the most involved in the global financial world and have the most impact, half of them are American. If you look at our strategic situation, we are blessed by 2 oceans that separate us from everybody else. And then we have 2 friendly countries on our northern and southern borders who are now our largest trading partners. Mexico is now past China. So we have a very, very favorable strategic situation. We also have the strongest network of alliances in the world, even despite what Donald Trump is trying to do to kill some of those. And China can't come close to having any of those kinds of friendships around the world that they can draw on. And we have a tremendous soft power. People still admire the American example. And as an American diplomat, you know, people would always come and tell us about all the television programs that they were watching and all of the sports programs. And I was amazed at the number of people that knew about American football in a place like Indonesia. But that's because of American television and, you know, the digital economy. And you know, everybody watches American movies. And a lot of people want to go to American schools because they know that we have some of the best American universities in the world. So don't believe all that you hear about the decline of America. We are still in a very, very strong position. And even if Donald Trump is elected, there's only so many things that he can do to stop that. And I really mean that. And so I don't despair is what I'd like to tell you. we are still in a strong position, and we have a lot to be thankful for.
Well, Bob, thank you. First of all, thank you for that uplifting ending, and which is glass more than half full. But wonderful, as you hear. I mean, wonderful conversation. Incredible your experience and depth of knowledge on all these subjects. Thank you so much for sharing with us, for being here. Thank you all for being here this evening. Terrific. Yep.
I would also like to thank the ambassador and also the dean, who has led incredible conversations over the last year and a half, I think. It has been, I always say this at every meeting, so I'm sorry if I bore you, but I'm always blown away by the stuff I don't know. And I think there's stuff that we think we know, but we don't know. And when we have speakers like you speak, it really opens doors and widens our perspective in the world. The other thing I would add, and this is a comment more than a question, but I work with a lot of international companies and I work with a lot of national companies, and peer pressure has a lot of impact on their perception of climate change. And I get a lot of calls, how can I comply with this? Or how can I go to this level? And so I think we lose that as private citizens, that people are concerned about how we look in the rest of the world. And let's go with the shallow scope here. Change things. And I'm just so glad you've spoken to us about this tonight, because it is an important subject and we are all more enlightened by it. You can sit down, but I do have a couple of announcements to make. So we're going to bring things down next month. We've got Russia versus the West with Nicholas Gorstani, and it's going to be an excellent conversation. It really has to do with Russia, Ukraine, and Russia's role in the world. So we're really looking forward to that. That is on March 14th. The other thing is, we've talked about Africa a couple of times tonight at the table and on up here. We have Singumbe Muyumba and Abigail Kabandula from, I believe, are they from, yeah, University of Denver. I was going to say, I couldn't remember if they were from Regis or University of Corbell. Yeah. But they're going to be talking about Africa and really the role of Africa in the world and a number of other subjects related to that. And I think the thing we don't talk about in the news is Africa's role in the world. And I know John over here has been big into trying to introduce us to people in Africa. It is not just a single country. It's a bunch of countries. And each has its own perspective in the world. Each has its own issues. But it is going to be, as a continent, one of the most important change factors, I think, in the next 100 years. So, important conversation, April 10. April 10. And then we have the Global Engagement Award with Richard Lackey, who's with the World Food Bank. And what most people don't realize is the World Food Bank is run out of Denver, Colorado. Actually, it's a suburb, but it's out of Denver. But he's going to be talking about Africa, about climate change, about farming, agriculture, and everything that goes into what's going on in the world today. What we don't realize, and he always says this, Africa is an incredibly rich continent. It just doesn't realize it. And so I hope everybody can be at those occasions. You're invited back, by the way. You come through. And I finally would like to thank Sherry for getting this program together. It was critical that her role in this organization has, quite frankly, transformed this organization in the last 3 months. I don't think you understand how much I have to deal with as a president, and everybody on board and everything else doesn't realize the incredible impact you've had on this organization. I really appreciate that. And I'm also going to refer to Casey again once more. Wow, there's a lot of stuff going on. And I know that we've got other people. in the room here that have been incredible with bringing a newer generation to this organization.